Britain had survived its darkest hour, but the fire that had been contained to Western Europe was about to explode across two continents at once. First into the endless steppes of Russia, and then, in a single morning of fire and steel, into the waters of the Pacific. At 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June 1941, over 3 million German, Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish troops surged across a front stretching more than 1,000 miles, launching the largest land invasion in human history against a Soviet Union that had trusted a pact of non-aggression. It was the beginning of a war of annihilation unlike anything the world had witnessed. A campaign that would eventually claim more lives than any single military operation in recorded history. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning half a world away, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft would descend upon a sleeping American naval base in Hawaii, dragging the United States into a war it had tried desperately to avoid. Within days, what had been a European conflict and an Asian war would fuse into a single, truly global catastrophe, stretching from the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the burning sands of North Africa, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the skies above Midway Atoll. This is part 2 of the complete history of World War II. The story of how the war became global, how it reached its most murderous depths, and how, against all expectation, the tide of history began, slowly and at staggering cost, to turn. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed his moment had finally arrived. Britain, though unconquered, posed no immediate threat to continental Europe, and Hitler had never truly abandoned the ideological core of his worldview, the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism and the conquest of vast living space in the East for German settlement. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had always been, in Hitler's mind, a temporary convenience. On the 22nd of June 1941, he unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force ever assembled, crashing into Soviet territory along a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Stalin, despite repeated warnings from his own intelligence services and even direct tips from Allied sources, had refused to believe Hitler would attack, and the Red Army was caught catastrophically unprepared. German Army Group Center North and South tore through Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies in massive pockets, at Minsk, at Smolensk, and above all at Kiev, where in September 1941 over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the single largest encirclement in military history. By October, German forces stood within sight of Moscow's suburbs, and Hitler's propaganda machine already spoke of victory as inevitable. But 3 factors combined to save the Soviet Union that autumn: distance, weather, and the astonishing capacity of the Soviet system to absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. As German supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the vast Russian landscape, the autumn rains turned roads to impassable mud, a period Russians called the Rasputitsa. Then came winter, arriving with brutal ferocity, and German troops, equipped for a short summer campaign, froze in their summer uniforms as temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, engines failed to start, and weapons jammed solid. Stalin, meanwhile, ordered an extraordinary feat of industrial evacuation, relocating entire factories, machinery and all, over 1,000 miles east beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach, where they resumed weapons production within weeks. In December 1941, fresh Siberian divisions, transferred west once Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, launched a counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from the gates of Moscow. The myth of German invincibility had been broken for the first time. Hitler's gamble on a swift, decisive victory had failed, and Germany now faced the war of attrition it could least afford. The invasion of the Soviet Union also unleashed the most horrific phase of Nazi racial policy. Behind the advancing German lines, mobile killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen, supported by regular army units and local collaborators, systematically murdered Jews, Roma, communist officials, and other perceived enemies, shooting victims by the hundreds of thousands into mass graves. At Babi Yar outside Kiev alone, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days in September 1941. This campaign of mass shooting, while horrifically efficient, was deemed by Nazi leadership too slow and psychologically taxing on the perpetrators themselves. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to coordinate what they euphemistically called the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic, industrialized extermination of European Jewry. Purpose-built death camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek were constructed or expanded specifically for mass murder using poison gas, functioning as factories of death that would ultimately claim the lives of approximately 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other victims including Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, and gay men. This genocide, known as the Holocaust, stands as one of history's darkest chapters and remains central to understanding the true nature of the Nazi regime and the moral stakes of the Allied war effort. While the German-Soviet War ground into its second year, tensions in the Pacific reached their breaking point. Japan's invasion of China had drawn increasing American condemnation, and when Japanese forces occupied French Indochina in 1941, the United States responded with an oil embargo that threatened to strangle Japan's war machine within months. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. Japanese military leadership, convinced that a negotiated settlement was impossible and that time favored the Americans, gambled on a devastating preemptive strike. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, Japanese aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers struck the American Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In under 2 hours, the attack sank or damaged 19 American ships, including 8 battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. President Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, declaring the 7th of December a date which will live in infamy, and the United States declared war on Japan within hours. For days later, Hitler, honoring his alliance with Japan though under no obligation to do so, declared war on the United States, a decision historians widely regard as one of his most catastrophic strategic blunders, drawing the industrial might of America fully into the European theater. Japan's early momentum in the Pacific was staggering. Within months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, seizing vast territories and resources across Southeast Asia and pushing the boundaries of their empire to the very approaches of Australia and India. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, where roughly 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, was described by Churchill as the worst disaster in British military history. But American resolve, fueled by fury over Pearl Harbor, hardened rapidly, and the tide began to turn within just 6 months. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea became the first naval battle in history fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft, with opposing fleets never sighting one another directly, halting Japan's advance toward Australia. Then, in June 1942, American codebreakers who had cracked Japan's naval cipher gave Admiral Chester Nimitz crucial advance warning of a planned Japanese assault on Midway Atoll. In the resulting Battle of Midway, American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers with their flight decks cluttered with fueled and armed aircraft, sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day, a catastrophic loss from which Japan's naval air power never fully recovered. Historians regard Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, though brutal fighting would continue for 3 more years, beginning with the grinding, disease-ridden jungle campaign for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where American Marines fought through 6 months of some of the war's most savage combat. In North Africa, the war had raged since 1940, when Italian forces invaded Egypt from their colony in Libya, only to be pushed back decisively by British Commonwealth troops. Hitler, unwilling to let his ally collapse, dispatched the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, whose bold tactical maneuvers earned him the nickname the Desert Fox, and pushed British forces back deep into Egypt by mid-1942, threatening the vital Suez Canal. The campaign reached its climax at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, where British General Bernard Montgomery, commanding superior numbers and material following American Lend-Lease support, ground down Rommel's forces in a brutal battle of attrition and forced a retreat that never reversed. Churchill would later remark that before Alamein, the Allies had never won a battle, and after Alamein they never lost one. An overstatement, but one capturing a genuine turning point. Days later, in November 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa in Operation Torch, opening a second front that would eventually squeeze Axis forces into surrender in Tunisia by May 1943, clearing North Africa entirely and setting the stage for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Yet it was on the Eastern Front, in a ruined industrial city on the banks of the Volga River, that the war's single most decisive turning point unfolded. In the summer of 1942, having failed to take Moscow, Hitler redirected his offensive south, aiming to seize the Caucasus oil fields and cut off Soviet supply lines along the Volga, with the city of Stalingrad bearing Stalin's own name and therefore of immense symbolic as well as strategic value, as the campaign's central objective. What followed was one of the most horrific battles in human history. German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus fought Soviet defenders under General Vasily Chukov through the ruins of the city street by street, building by building, floor by floor, in combat so close quarters that Soviet soldiers grimly called it rat warfare. By November 1942, as German forces remained bogged down in the shattered city, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer offensive using fresh reserves to encircle the entire German Sixth Army, some 250,000 men, trapping them inside Stalingrad's ruins as winter closed in. Hitler, obsessed with prestige and refusing to permit a breakout, forbade retreat and promised resupply by air that never came close to meeting the trapped army's needs. Starving, frozen, and out of ammunition, Field Marshal Paulus, promoted by Hitler in a pointed hint that he should die rather than surrender, since no German field marshal had ever been captured alive, finally surrendered on the 2nd of February 1943, defying Hitler's expectations. Of roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad, only a few thousand would ever return home from Soviet captivity years later. The Battle of Stalingrad, with combined casualties estimated at nearly 2 million, shattered the myth of German military invincibility once and for all, and marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward that would not stop until it reached Berlin itself. By the summer of 1943, the strategic momentum of the war had irreversibly shifted against the Axis powers. In July, Hitler attempted one final major offensive on the Eastern Front at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, hoping to regain the initiative by pinching off a Soviet salient with a massive pincer assault. Soviet intelligence, forewarned of German plans, had constructed defenses in staggering depth, and the resulting battle, though a tactical draw in places, bled the German panzer forces so severely that Hitler could never again mount a major strategic offensive in the east. From Kursk onward, the German army in Russia was permanently on the defensive, retreating steadily under relentless Soviet pressure. Simultaneously, in the Mediterranean, Allied forces launched the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, prompting the collapse of Mussolini's government. The fascist Grand Council itself voted to remove him from power, and King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. Italy's new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies, announced in September 1943, though German forces, anticipating exactly this betrayal, swiftly occupied most of Italy, rescued Mussolini in a daring commando raid, and installed him as the puppet ruler of a rump fascist state in the north, while Allied forces began a grinding, costly campaign up the Italian peninsula against determined German resistance in the mountainous terrain. By the close of 1943, the strategic picture had transformed entirely from the dark days of 1941 and 1942. Germany and Japan were everywhere in retreat. The Holocaust machinery of death continued its horrific work even as Allied bombers began systematically pounding German industry and cities from the air, and in conference rooms in Tehran, Allied leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin now met not merely to survive the war, but to plan its ending and the shape of the world that would follow. In Tehran, the Allied leaders agreed on a date and a plan for the invasion that would open the war's final and most decisive chapter, a landing on the beaches of Normandy that would begin the liberation of a continent.